Our session this morning will be dedicated, as Eugene said, to the challenge of maintaining a moral compass in the changing moral and military realities of the 21st century. We'll be guided in this quest by two of the world's most eminent moral philosophers in this regard. We are only in the 12th year of this century, but the assumptions of warfare have already changed dramatically. The days are long gone when one state army in uniform fought another similar army, when you could easily tell the combatant from the non-threatening civilian. But even when that was possible, as in the Second World War, democracies such as the United States and Great Britain practiced virtual, unrestricted warfare that targeted civilians as a means of weakening the morale and military and material support of enemy states. They did this both in situations that Professor Walzer has described as supreme emergencies, such as the years when there was a realistic possibility of a Nazi victory, and they did it when there wasn't such a possibility, when their primary concern was hastening the end of the war and limiting the number of Allied casualties. As Professor Walzer pointed out, the Allies never really considered the Holocaust sufficient reason to risk their own soldiers. Subsequently, moral philosophers such as our speakers today have led a revolution in military thinking that has returned non-combatants to the calculus of military morality. And at the same time, this evolution in moral sensitivity has brought with it a new challenge: the use of civilian populations themselves as human shields providing cover for military operations. This wasn't possible in the past because no one in Washington during World War II was particularly concerned with the number of German casualties, and all the more so, no one in Moscow, and of course vice versa. Today we live in an age not only of military asymmetry, but also of moral asymmetry, in which the exploitation of one's enemy's moral sensitivity has itself become a weapon of war. And when one side of the conflict is willing to trade the lives of a large number of its own population in order to inflict an intolerable price on the other side, nations striving to maintain their own moral compass find themselves in terrible dilemmas. What types of dangers are we willing to impose on the young men and women whom we compel or entice into donning uniforms? Is there a difference between acceptable risk in a time of supreme national emergency when everything is on the line, as perhaps it was in 1948 or 1967 or 1973, and in situations of low-intensity conflict in which one's national existence is not necessarily in immediate danger, but in which the other side, civilians, have been propelled into the center of the battlefield? I personally witnessed situations of this sort in Lebanon and in Jenin, in which I saw comrades in the infantry in Lebanon lose their lives in situations in which the use of less discriminating means than infantry may have meant fewer casualties on our side. But I must say that at that point, I was 28 years old, I was in the thick of the fighting, and I took these risks for granted. I must admit to finding it much more difficult to confront these same issues in Jenin, when 23 soldiers fell there from a much younger generation, including the sons of two close friends. Therefore, we must also, I think, ask, is there still a legitimacy at all to the concept of us and them? We learn in the book of Genesis that all men were created equal, and in the Midrash of the book of Numbers, Haba lehorgecha hashkem lehorgo. If someone comes to kill you, first kill them. It may be tempting to consider all enemy civilians as being complicit in the outrages that are committed in their name, but in all too many cases this is not the case. Consider the implications of non-conventional arms in the hands of people who are really willing to trade tens of millions of lives of their own fellow citizens in order to kill millions of ours. For 2,000 years, Jews have followed whatever debate there was about warfare from the perspective of victims. There were precious few military dilemmas to concern us, as even when Jews fought on the battlefield, we did so under the orders of others. With the establishment of the State of Israel, we have returned to the stage of history. Our power brings with it responsibility, and we are in need of leadership to help guide us through the quagmire. For that, we turn to our sources and to our thinkers. And today we are privileged to have with us two of the preeminent philosophers of our day. Professor Michael Walzer is a professor emeritus of social science at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. As a professor, author, and lecturer, Michael Walzer has addressed a wide variety of topics in political theory and moral philosophy: political obligation, just and unjust war, nationalism and ethnicity, economic justice, and the welfare state. His books, which include Just and Unjust Wars, probably the seminal work in this field, Spheres of Justice, and many others, his essays have played a part in the revival of practical, issue-focused ethics and in the development of a pluralistic approach to political and moral life. Professor Walzer is a contributing editor for The New Republic and a co-editor of Dissent, now in its 58th year. His articles and interviews frequently appear in the world's foremost newspapers and journals. He is currently working on the toleration and accommodation of difference in all its forms, a collaborative project focused on the history of Jewish political thought. In May 2012, Yale University was to have released God's Shadow, right? The politics in the Hebrew Bible. Professor Asa Kasher is the Laura Schwartz-Kipp Professor of Professional Ethics and Philosophy of Practice at Tel Aviv University. He authored the Code of Conduct of the Israel Defense Forces and has written influential essays on Israel as a Jewish and democratic state and on Israel's law of return. Accorded the Israel Prize in the year 2000, Professor Kasher is the editor of the philosophical journal Philosophia. Professor Kasher was a professor at the IDF College of Command and the General Staff and has taught at Oxford, UCLA, a host of other universities. He has edited more than 15 volumes on general philosophy, military ethics, and bioethics. Professor Kasher was a member of the Helsinki Committee, and he has held the positions of the president of the Israel Philosophical Association, the vice chair of the Ethics Center of Jerusalem, and as a member of the Public Committee of the Ethics of Knesset Members, the Bioethics Council, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, and in many other endeavors in this field. We today are honored for our own Morei Nuvuchim to lead us through the abyss of trying to understand what to actually do when we're confronted with these issues. Professor Walzer, please.
And so today I'm going to rehearse an argument from conventional just war theory and then try to apply it to the new circumstances of asymmetric warfare. I'm going to talk about proportionality and responsibility in the conduct of war. Proportionality arguments are very old, and they've always been highly elastic, easily stretched to cover whatever needs to be covered. It's mostly civilian casualties that need to be covered, unintended but foreseeable collateral damage. The argument is well known, but I'm going to provide a very simple example. Here is a factory making tanks for the German war effort during World War II. The factory is located in a working-class neighborhood. It wasn't put there in order to benefit from the civilian cover. That's where factories were built before workers had cars. The factory just is where it is. The Allies believe that it's very important, as it was, to stop the production of tanks. They do not intend to kill civilians, but they know that some number, possibly given the aiming devices available in 1943, a large number of civilians living nearby will be killed if they bomb the factory. They believe that this number is not disproportionate to the value of stopping the production of tanks. In fact, almost any number could plausibly be described in that way, given the importance of the military objective. proportionality was or used to be a very permissive doctrine. So long as the injuries and deaths were not intended, there could be a large number of them and no one would complain. I mean, no one except the injured civilians and the families of the dead. But there is something wrong with a limit that isn't limiting, that doesn't give us any clear sense of what to do and when to stop. So I argued 30 years ago that not intending the foreseeable deaths wasn't enough. It was necessary to intend that those deaths would not occur and to take positive measures to minimize their number, even if these positive measures had costs. Well, they would certainly have costs. Even something as simple as warning civilians to get out of the way has the obvious cost of warning enemy soldiers to get ready for an attack. And that's the issue that I meant to raise, and I've been arguing and worrying about it ever since, the issue of risk. What risks should soldiers take to reduce the risks they are imposing on civilians? And then there is an additional issue. Should this last question be answered differently for different groups of civilians? For fellow citizens, for enemy citizens, for citizens of neutral states, for complicit civilians, for innocents and civilians, for bystanders. But I'm not going to address that latter issue here, at least not directly, because it doesn't often arise in the circumstances of asymmetric warfare where the insurgent forces are hide among their own civilians, and it is these civilians, enemy civilians, who are at risk. And we can ask simply what risk should be taken when these lives are at stake. Now, it's important to emphasize that I'm not asking what risks soldiers should take to protect or rescue civilians, as in the Israeli raid on the Entebbe airport in 1976, or the American effort to rescue hostages in Iran in 1980. Here, the obligation to take risks derives from the fact that these are fellow citizens. Israel would have had no obligation to go to Entebbe or America to Iran if the hostages there had been Swedes or Bulgarians. The issue that I'm addressing here has nothing to do with protecting or rescuing civilians endangered by someone else. It has to do with reducing the risks that we are imposing on enemy civilians in the course of an attack launched by us on a military target. The point is not to protect them from hostile forces, but from our own forces. The point is to avoid killing them if that is possible. What risk should be taken for that purpose? Now, questions about risk are never easy. And the main point of my argument 30 years ago was simply to generate some resistance to the elasticity of proportionality calculations. I wanted soldiers and their officers to think about how to minimize civilian casualties, which they really didn't have to do in the old days once they decided that the number of likely deaths was not disproportionate to the value of the military target, and that was easy to decide. As I've just argued, it was too easy. The key phrase in that last sentence is some resistance to the old elasticity. My argument certainly didn't make the key factors any more precise, and I can't do that now. What positive measures should soldiers take, with what care, at what cost, at what risk? These were and are judgment calls. There's no possibility of saying they should accept a risk of 9 or 17 or 33. And even without precision, we also need to think about the limits to my limits. Since soldiers are already taking risks for the sake of their military mission, any additional risks can't endanger the mission, else the first set of risks would be pointless. What is called force protection is crucial to the success of the mission and to the possibility of future missions. And so this has to be given its proper weight. This means more judgment calls, but these difficult judgments are morally necessary. Officers making decisions in the field have to think about something besides proportionality. Call it responsibility. They have to take responsibility, first for their own soldiers, but also for the civilians they are putting at risk and for the deaths they cause, even in legitimate military operations. A morally responsible actor should try to reduce the numbers. And in judging their conduct, we should always ask, who is responsible for putting these civilians at risk? Now, for a moment, let's set risk and responsibility aside and turn back to proportionality. Something very strange has happened to the proportionality argument. These days, it doesn't justify too much. It hardly justifies anything at all. The highly permissive doctrine has become a highly restrictive doctrine. Indeed, sometimes it seems as if proportionality arguments have become the functional equivalent of pacifism. Their purpose is to make it impossible to fight. However, they don't do that in an even-handed way, as we will see if we consider the reasons for the change. The reasons have to do with the increasing number of asymmetric conflicts and also with what we might call the moral political surround of those conflicts. I mean by asymmetry a war or a series of engagements between small insurgent forces on one side who claim that they have no choice but to fight from civilian cover and to attack vulnerable civilian populations. Terrorism isn't their last resort, but their only resort. And on the other side, modern high-tech armies. The newly restrictive proportionality argument works against the high-tech armies. I thought Professor Applebaum was a little too willing to accept the burdens that are imposed on high-tech armies in these conflicts. There are burdens, but we do have to make sure that they are not disabling. Now, assume that the terrorist attacks on civilians are unsuccessful. A few civilians are killed, which is what we hope for. And then it will turn out that most of the killing is done by armies responding to the attacks. The ratio of army killing to insurgent killing may get as high as 100-to-1, as it did in the Gaza war, and this looks disproportionate and is quickly criticized in two different ways. The first way is common but obviously wrong. Think of how proportionality works, say, in a family feud in Kentucky between those famous American families, the Hatfields and the McCoys. The Hatfields kill 2 McCoys, and then the McCoys are entitled to kill 2 Hatfields. That's a proportionate response. Nothing more is permitted. And then the feud is over, at least temporarily, and everybody goes home. Any number higher than 2 will be called disproportionate and will continue the feud. Here, proportionality is a backward-looking measure, and that's the way a lot of people understand it. That's the way the UN Secretary General seemed to understand it when he called the Israeli response to Hezbollah's 2006 raid disproportionate. He seemed to think that the IDF should kill the same number of fighters as the Hezbollah raiders had killed and capture the same number, and that should be the end of the story. But this wasn't a family feud. In war, proportionality is a forward-looking measure. Unintended civilian deaths are supposed to be measured against the value of seizing or destroying a particular target, as in stopping the production of tanks in my first example. But if the target is a single terrorist cadre hiding in a village in Pakistan, say, or a rocket launching team firing from the front of an apartment building in Gaza, as it often will be in asymmetric warfare, even a low number of civilian deaths will seem hard to justify. And it is in this context that proportionality arguments have become highly restrictive. We might argue for a cumulative measure. What is the military value not of hitting this cadre or this team, but of stopping or slowing down the terrorist attacks overall? That's a better question. And if taken seriously, it might provide a useful standard. But still, if the attacks have been highly ineffective, proportionality can still be a very restrictive doctrine. And so this is the second way, better than the Family Feud model, but still not right, of condemning the high-tech Army's response to insurgent and terrorist attacks. So at this point, we need to turn back to the responsibility argument. Who is putting these civilians at risk? The immediate answer is that they are being put at risk by the insurgents or terrorists who hide among the civilian population or fire from civilian cover. It's a hard argument to make politically these days, though it's readily understood in the starkest cases. If civilian hostages are strapped to tanks that then drive into battle, the soldiers who fire at the tanks and kill the hostages are not responsible for the deaths they cause. The killing of innocent persons is their work, but not their fault. On the other hand, if there were a way of disabling the tanks without killing the hostages, that is what the soldiers should do, even if doing it is, let's say, marginally more risky for them. Similarly, in responding to attacks from civilian cover, soldiers must make some effort to find out how many civilians are at risk, so proportionality can be calculated, at least roughly, and some effort to get close enough to aim at the insurgent or terrorist cadre. They are not without responsibility in cases like these, but it is critically important to insist on the initial shift of responsibility to the other side. When we think about the risks that soldiers must take in asymmetric warfare, there is a relevant political argument that I want to notice but not focus on. Often the insurgents are not hiding among civilians for their own protection. The phrase human shields may be misleading. They are hiding among civilians in order to expose those civilians to attack, because they believe, and they are probably right, that the death of those civilians will work to their advantage. And so that would suggest that the risk soldiers take to minimize civilian deaths may well be required by their military mission or by the political military mission, and not by mere morality. But my own interest here today is in mere morality. The insurgents, of course, don't acknowledge that they're deliberately exposing civilians. They claim that if they don't fight from civilian cover, they will increase the risk to themselves and to their cause. Now, suppose their cause is just, as in, say, the national liberation struggle of Algerians against the French in the 1950s, an early example of asymmetric warfare. What risks must the Algerian insurgents accept? They certainly can't put bombs in cafes and bus stations as they did. The deliberate killing of innocent people is ruled out from the beginning. They must seek alternative ways of fighting, even if the risks of failure are greater. Fighting from civilian cover is a harder question than deliberately aiming at civilians. Clearly, the responsibility for the dangers that civilians now face lies first of all with the insurgents who are using them. But the attacking soldiers must also answer questions about the dangers their attack produces. What risks are they bound to accept to minimize that danger? And at this point in the argument, we need to think about whether there is a kind of baseline for our non-mathematical calculations of risk. And I'm going to describe a couple of hypotheticals to give you a sense of the problem of baselines. I'm going to leave, I was supposed to do, I meant to do both the insurgents and the army, but let me just do the army. Imagine an army planning an attack on a legitimate military target. Insurgents hold up somewhere. Its tactical experts have worked out a plan that involves some degree of risk for the soldiers, but given the target's importance, the risks are acceptable. And there are foreseeable civilian deaths, but the number is not disproportionate to the value of the target. And now a junior officer comes along and says that he has a plan that will reduce the risks to soldiers, but increase the risks to civilians. If this officer's proposal is adopted, it would be the soldiers would be offloading risk from themselves onto innocent civilians. They wouldn't be using the civilians as shields, but they would be benefiting from a strategy that deliberately put civilians in harm's way for the sake of the benefit. And I think we would not want them to do that. Now imagine another junior officer who has a plan that will greatly reduce the risks to civilians, but increase slightly the risks to soldiers. Slightly because, for the purposes of my hypothetical, I don't want any increased risk to endanger the mission. So it will reduce the risks to civilians, but increase slightly the risks to soldiers, but not endanger the mission, should the soldiers be asked to accept the added risk. And I find it easier to say no to my first question, they can't offload risk onto civilians, than yes to the second about adding risk for themselves. But both those answers, the first no and the second yes, are probably right. They suggest what responsible people, moral agents, ought to do in the circumstances of war. But those were highly artificial examples. In practice, in the actual circumstances of warfare, we don't have a baseline. And we don't know at any moment in real time if the question soldiers face is about offloading risk or adding it on. So perhaps we needn't work very hard to distinguish between these two. We should just notice that these are two possible ways of describing the situation. And then all we need is an argument about risk itself, which should go this way: in planning and conducting military operations that endanger innocent civilians, soldiers, insurgents also, must take care and take risks to reduce the dangers. They have choices to make, and the lives of unarmed and vulnerable men, women, and children have to figure significantly in those choices. I'm not going to make any effort to specify how much risk soldiers or insurgents ought to accept. But if we can't say how much, we can sometimes say not enough. Warning civilians to leave a specified area, for example, and accepting the risk of also warning soldiers or insurgents to get ready for an attack. These are good things to do. They are not enough to justify indiscriminate attacks afterwards. This is from the American experience with free fire zones in Vietnam. We learned that many civilians don't leave, even after repeated warnings. They stay on because they are old and sick, or they stay on because they are caring for relatives who are old and sick, or because they are afraid that their homes will be looted if they leave, or simply because they have no place to go. It's a good thing to issue the warnings, but there will still be work that has to be done to figure out how many civilians remain in the area and to look for ways of reducing the risks imposed on them by our attack. Again, how much of this sort of work is morally necessary? Exactly how much is morally necessary is a judgment call, and the judgments have to be made by officers in the field. International law and just war theory can only provide rough guidelines. Still, the guidelines are important, and the training of soldiers should include a serious engagement with those guidelines, and it should also include exercises that prepare soldiers to apply the guidelines in tough circumstances. It is incompetence, above all, that produces brutality. And so we need soldiers who are trained to act competently in these difficult situations. Only this kind of training can give us confidence in the judgment calls to come. And since we are all of us civilians at some point in our lives, and many of our friends and relatives are civilians right now, we need that confidence. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Professor Shalom and Major General Gershon for inviting me to take part in this highly interesting gathering related to military ethics in the 21st century. It is always a pleasure to share a panel with Michael Walzer. We've done it a number of times in the past. The last time we did it, Professor Walzer summarized the debate in terms of him being the conservative and me being the radical under the circumstances. Now I'm not going to repeat the same debate presently, and I'm not going to play the role of a radical. I'd like to play the role of a constructive thought about how to improve things. I have not come to suggest burying just war theory or international law. Actually, I've come to praise them, but also to change them in some major ways. Let me start with what we share, which are important principles that we perhaps share for different reasons. First of all, peace is better than war. And although intuitively everyone accepts it, in a democracy, I'd like to emphasize one of the major reasons for my support for that kind of an obvious principle. A democracy, like the United States or Israel or UK, has to protect the life of its citizens, because usually if they're not alive, they cannot enjoy their liberties, their rights, they cannot implement their values. So it's quite obvious that the life should be protected. And since whenever a person cannot protect one's own life, it is the duty of the state to make arrangements for such protection. Now, most of the citizens in a state are protected by military forces, whether it's Army or Navy, Marines or Air Force, whether it's CIA or some other intelligence agency, it doesn't matter. But there is a whole cluster of organizations that protect the civilians. But the civilians constitute just part of the population. Who protects the protectors is a question that should be asked, because they're also citizens. And in the case of Israel, to which I will return, as my friend Ishai Ber predicted, then some of those protectors are conscripts, actually, or on reserve duties. So who protects them? How does the democracy, how does the democratic state show its concern for the life of its combatants? And the best answer that a democracy can provide its combatants with is that it pursues peace. It pursues peace, which means it pursues that system that provides the combatants with the better type of protection. There is no protection better than peace when you look at it from the point of view of combatants. Usually, combatants do not get killed in battles against enemy forces when there is peace between the adjacent states. So it is the duty of a democracy to pursue peace. It's not a matter of policies of a certain government. It's the duty of the democratic regime. And therefore, peace is better than war, particularly from that perspective of protecting the life of the combatants. Then there is another shared principle. If there is if there is war, let us follow an old formula of alleviating the calamities or minimizing damages or something similar. Okay, there is war is bound to inflict a lot of harm, casualties on both sides, and destruction, and wounded people in huge numbers. Let's try to minimize. Thank you very much. Let's do our best to minimize those calamities. Now, here is where one can praise the logic of international law on grounds of just war theory, but see the limitations that it suffers from. Okay, the logic of international law is take the major dimensions of warfare. It's people, targets, means, and methods, and then cut each dimension into two and forbid acting within one half of the dimension and allow acting on the other half of the dimension. So let's draw a distinction between civilians and combatants. Leave the civilians alone, fight the combatants. Okay, there are targets. There are civilian targets, don't hit them. There are legitimate military targets, hit them. Then there are different types of ammunition, different types of bombs. Don't use some of them, use the other ones. The different methods of employing those means against the enemy, use many of them. Don't use all of them. There are means that are forbidden. So the logic is impeccable, but the implementation is problematic because it's crude. This distinction, the divisions are crude because we need something much more complicated and much more sophisticated in order to act morally. I'd like to show in some detail. I don't have too much time, so I'll do it very briefly, and I'll take just a couple of examples, couple or slightly more than that, and to show the problems that emerge when we look at the current arrangements of international law and using other sources for those considerations. To express my practical conclusion at the very beginning, I think that we need a whole new family of doctrines that are all in the spirit of just war doctrine. They respect the major insights of just war doctrine. They're in the spirit of international law, but they are really novel. And they're not just some kind of legal manipulation and reinterpretation of some old principles that do not apply under the circumstances. Let me start by cyber war. Cyber war is interesting because everything in cyber war is similar to a certain field of military activity that the international arrangements have left out, namely spying. Okay, if a spy is if a spy is a member of a military force, he does not enter the enemy territory wearing the military force. I mean, he is engaged in covert operation. Covert operation in the strict sense that it shouldn't be clear at all. It shouldn't be clear to anybody that he is acting on the behalf of an enemy state. So spying is done by everyone against enemy. However, when spies are caught, they do not enjoy the status of POWs. They are brought to the local justice, local court, and for a long period they are executed by the state that caught them. Now, those covert operations are one major idea in covert operation is deniability. When you carry out a covert operation, you can deny. If a state carries out a covert operation, it can deny its involvement in carrying it out. I don't know whether you noticed it. In the in the Operation Neptune Spear that killed Osama bin Laden, it was done by the SEALs of the Navy. It was planned and carried out by the Special Forces commander, but it was done under the CIA. It was done under the CIA in order for it to be deniable. I'm not giving you any internal information, just the books I read about it. They all say it. And some officials also volunteered that kind of information. So it was CIA operation because CIA, by the act that established the CIA, can get involved in deniable activities. Okay, so when you do something which is parallel to spying, then in the cyberspace, the cyber attack cannot be identified. Okay, it's really ridiculous to think in terms of, okay, you attack by some electronic means the computers of the enemy, but you posit on the program that you send there that this is your program. Okay, if the enemy knows that this is your program, then it's not your program. It's meaningless. It's worthless. So you must carry out the cyber attack as a form of covert operation. So we don't have real arrangements in international law and otherwise for those covert operations which were left out, like spying. Secondly, covert operations in cyberspace can be conducted usually are conducted in indirect ways. I mean, the destructive program does not stem from a certain computer at the vicinity of Washington, D.C. and lands in a certain computer in Iran. Okay, it travels a long way and stops in all kinds of computers in between. And so stopping at a computer in between does not really involve the state where this computer resides. So if assume, just for the sake of argument, that on the way from the United States to Iran, it stopped in Norway, it doesn't mean that Norway was a party to that kind of cyber attack on computers in Iran. Again, something which the ordinary arrangements do not allow us to consider this way. Thirdly, there is a Russian company who are really experts in trying to understand cyber attacks. So when the famous attack was made on the nuclear sites of Iran, they help everyone for money, so they help the certain governments as well, and now they disturb you when you conduct your cyber attacks, if you think of it this way. So what should be done in terms of cyber war to those who disturb you? When you look at ordinary military activities, if you disturb me during war, then you side with the enemy. But if you disturb me by just analyzing the structure of the programs, should we attack you? Should the Russian company be attacked by cyber forces? And so on and so forth. One can show that cyber war is a war. You can destroy a state. You can seed death and destruction and injury by sending those programs, and everyone understands it. I read a speech that the chief legal advisor of the Department of State gave Harvard recently, I think it was, and he stated openly the vision of the perception of the United States concerning cyber war. It is war. It can be a war to the extent that it justifies a counterattack, not necessarily cyber one and things like this. Okay, it is a war, undoubtedly. But to run it according to the principles of in bello that we read in the ICRC documents is really ridiculous. It doesn't provide us with real direction, with real moral directives. There is the tailing. There is an very interesting book to appear in 2013 by Cambridge University Press. It is a document produced under the auspices of NATO to govern cyber war. It's 250 pages long. It's much better than a speech where the advisor answers 10 questions, but it is still impractical when you think about it from the point of view of those who have to participate in such a type of war. We need a completely different type of doctrine for cyber war. Necessity, proportionality, distinction, humanity, they are all relevant. But the way they are going to be expressed is completely different, should be completely different. A second example I'd mention very briefly, because Professor Walzer touched it, is the usage of human shield as a strategy. Okay, there are two kinds of, as Professor Walzer said, there are two kinds of human shield. One kind of human shield is that the terrorists or insurgents, they render civilians human shield. It's not those civilians themselves who render themselves human shields, but under all circumstances, it blurs the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. There is a third, all the distinctions are crude, and you see that there is a third group of people, those who serve as human shields for one reason or other. And one must introduce new doctrines concerning the right moral attitude towards those intermediate groups. Something like give them a their presence lesser significance when you do the proportionality considerations, but still try to minimize casualties among them, which is a combination of two different attitudes, normally not present under the same circumstances. Okay, a third point I'd like to make is, and I just spent 2 sentences on it. As Professor Walzer and many others have clarified, the notion of proportionality is very difficult to implement. And I'd like to add that the notion of necessity and the notion of distinction and even the notion of humanity are quite problematic. The humanity principle is perhaps the best understood, but all the others are very vague. And usually, because they're vague, they're very elastic, as Professor Walzer put it, and politically abused quite often. How can the Secretary of the United Nations, 5 minutes after the 2006 war in Lebanon started, say it was excessive? Do you have the map? Do you know the forces? Do you know the intentions? Do you know the plans? Can you say that it could have been done with lesser forces and things like this? So it's politics. It's not real. It's not morality, not even international law. But I won't elaborate on that too much. I'd like to spend my last few minutes of this presentation in speaking about the human life and dignity of the combatant. The Israeli situation is very interesting and, in a sense, nowadays unique. And if you think in terms of it, you can shed light on other situations as well. But let me start with the Israeli situation. In the Israeli situation, most of the warriors, most of the combatants are conscripts or people on reserve duty. So I'll speak about conscripts for the sake of simplicity, but it's the same. Okay, a conscript is a person who is wearing military uniform because he's under the obligation to do it by the state. There is a law that requires it. Now, recall what I said at the beginning about the duty of the state to protect the life of its citizens. There is a duty on the part of the state to protect the life of its citizens, including that conscript. Okay, now, which means that the state has to have excellent reasons for jeopardizing the life of the conscript. Since it's a democracy, it requires excellent reasons for having conscripts at all. But I take it for granted that the reasons are perfect and there's no problem in maintaining the system of conscription. But jeopardizing the life of a conscript is something else. I think the state owes, I wrote about it in terms of the soldier's question. Okay, the soldier has the right to pose the following question to his state through the commanders. Okay, sir, why do you jeopardize my life by sending me there? So the state owes him an explanation, not in written before the operation takes place, but say systematically. The state owes him an explanation why his life is jeopardized in fighting against certain people in Lebanon or in Gaza. I think the state has a perfect answer to this question. Now, why should I jeopardize my life now in this alley in a certain village in Gaza? That's more complicated. But I assume that under many circumstances there is a good explanation. But to use an example that Professor Walzer mentioned, assume that the state answers the soldier's question by saying, Sergeant Israeli, we send you into this house, jeopardizing your life, because there are some people there who are not combatants but civilians. We warned them, as you heard several times. Knocking on the roof is something you yourself heard, but as we have excellent intelligence and we know what they are talking about, and they don't want to leave their apartment because they're afraid of it being looted. So in order to respect their attitude of being afraid that their apartment is not going to be looted, now you're going to risk your life. And to enter the house, in which there are not only those who are afraid of being looted, but also terrorists, and they're going to shoot, and you're going to jeopardize your life. Perhaps you're not going to return home safely because they're afraid of their apartment getting looted. That's immoral. That's something that a democracy cannot provide as an answer to the soldier. That's an utterly immoral justification of jeopardizing life of people. Now, thinking about this, one can start asking questions about volunteers. People, American forces, and many of the Israeli, but maybe not a minority, but not the insignificant one, are volunteers. They have volunteered to participate in dangerous activities. Now, volunteering is not enough. One can volunteer to be a slave, but no democracy is going to tolerate it. One can volunteer to have his hands and feet cut for some reasons. I mean, that's not good enough that it's volunteered. So there is the question about the institution of military forces. What justifies within the democratic regime the existence of an institution which is worse than slavery, in the sense that people apparently lost their rights not only for freedom and liberty, but also for life. So there is something wrong here. Something wrong in the extent to which we tolerate putting the life of soldiers, conscript, reserve duties, and volunteers into jeopardy under certain circumstances. Professor Walzer mentions responsibility, which is indeed of major importance. There is a dimension of responsibility, namely the responsibility of the commanders to their life and dignity of their troops, to the responsibility of the state to the life and dignity of their combatants, whether conscripts, volunteers, or others. So in conclusion, let me just say two additional sentences. As we draw distinctions that are better than previous ones, in between civilians and combatants we have several other groups, so the distinction is not crude. I think we must divide people in military uniform into groups. There are real hardcore combatants under warfare circumstances. Then there are other circumstances. Then there are other people in military uniform. There is a whole spectrum of people in military uniform, and simply rendering each and every one of them as a legitimate target of the enemy is morally wrong and should be changed. So a whole family of new doctrines must be developed. I like to suggest that this kind of development should not be the duty of experts in international law. It should be the duty of everyone interested in the moral implementation of practical implementation of moral principles, which means military commanders, which means philosophers, which means political scientists, which means even the public, to the extent that people in the public are willing to become more familiar and more fluent in those areas. Some new doctrines that are better, more moral than the present ones must be developed.
Thank you very much. We have time for a number of questions. Sir.
My question is to the second speaker, and that is there's something I read and just asked him to respond to that, which is that, for example, in the case of cyber war and the Stuxnet case, that there was actually parts of the code where the authors left references like to biblical characters or whatever. So in essence, once the virus was found and analyzed, the person who wrote it knew that they would probably be able to trace it back. So he wanted to sort of leave a note saying, yes, I really did it. I mean, it wasn't like the person, whoever did it signed their name, but there was something in there. And my sense is, from having read on other cases, is that you may not know exactly who did it, but you can kind of tell. So, for example, today, New York Times.
I'm not sure what the question is, sir.
Right, okay. Secretary. Okay, so the question is can we, yes, it seems like we can tell who does it. Maybe not immediately, but we can tell who launches the cyber attack eventually. So how would you respond to that kind of scenario? And do you think that's more effective?
I don't know anything about biblical verses mentioned in the programs that were sent to Iran. However, I think in terms of the model of covert operation. Okay, a good spy is a spy that you're never going to recognize as a spy. The moment that you do recognize or even get suspicious that this is a spy, he is not doing his work professionally. And here again, I mean, the experts in cyber war would not only be able to hide their identity, but would be able also to make the appearance that the author of that program is yourself.
Thank you. Ma'am in the red.
Respectfully, what is the responsibility of the IDF to those who go into battle or reserve duty for the IDF in the same district? The concept of do not leave anyone on the battlefield. What is known regarding the 5 Israeli soldiers who are missing? 3 since 1982, 1 since 1986, and 1 since 1997.
Thank you. I think we're going to table for a minute the question of information about Israeli soldiers. I don't believe that's the purpose of the panel, and I'm not sure that we have that information. But I think it is a valid question to ask Professor Walzer, unless Professor Kasher, you want to share information with us. To what extent are the commanders in the situations that you've posited here, where you're faced with, with split-second decisions, that we know that for gentlemen of your own stature are hard to contemplate after working on them for 30 years, when a young officer is 19 or 20 years old and has to make a decision whether he puts the lives of his soldiers ahead or behind those of enemy civilians, how does he come about making that decision?
Okay, so the question is a battlefield question. Here is a young officer in the field. He's faced with attacks from, he doesn't know exactly from whom or who is adjacent to the attackers. He has to make a decision. That's not a question for a professor sitting in an office in Princeton, New Jersey. Soldiers have to be trained to make those decisions. And those decisions are as difficult if there are no civilians, if there are no moral issues. It's just a question of how important is that target right now and how many soldiers can I risk to take the target. If it's a purely military decision, it is enormously difficult. And the officer has to make it, and therefore he has to be trained to make it, and he has to be put through exercises in which he rehearses making decisions of that kind. Look, let me give you an example. I gave a lecture very much like this at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where I met with some colonels who were just back from Afghanistan. They are the colonels who drafted what became the new code of conduct for U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, which does indeed require soldiers to take risks in order to minimize civilian deaths. And they gave me this scenario. American soldiers take fire from the roof of an apartment building, a small apartment building in an Afghan town. There are Taliban fighters on the roof. They don't know who's in the building. There could be families. Maybe it's empty. Maybe there are a few people who are strong supporters of the Taliban. Maybe there are terrified children. They don't know. So what do? Well, the colonel said, in the old days, they would just pull back and call in an airstrike. And that was standard procedure for U.S. Army in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan. And you took no risks for your soldiers, and you didn't intend to kill civilians. You just aimed at the Taliban fighters on the roof, and if civilians died, they died. And the colonel said, now we don't want to do that anymore. So what are the alternatives? Well, you can send a scouting party to the right and to the left and try to get onto an adjacent roof and see who's look in the windows of the building. You can try to get a soldier into the building. That's very risky for your men. Is that what you should do? Well, maybe. That's going to be a judgment call by the commander on the ground. But, the colonel said, you can also pull back and decide that you'll get the bad guys on the roof another time. And that, he said, is what we have to teach American soldiers to do, because they've been taught never leave the battlefield to the enemy. But sometimes, since you know you're going to have another crack at them, and you don't know who's in the building, maybe it's better politically as well as militarily to pull back. And then he looked to me, because I had just talked about risk-taking in Lebanon and Gaza. He looked at me and he said, we don't have to worry about a ceasefire. We have a lot of time. We know we'll see the bad guys again. But Israel always has to worry. Israel is always fighting in a hurry. And he knew that. This was a sympathetic comment. And of course, that's right. The choices which are hard enough in Afghanistan are harder still in Gaza. And that's true. There's no way of avoiding that truth.
Professor Kasher, if we take the same scenario and we move it from Afghanistan to Gaza, how would you tell that? And the officer says to you, is calling you on your cell phone. I have to decide what to do. Can you give me advice? What's the advice?
Okay. Two comments, one a brief one and then one conceptual, which is important. I generally agree with what Professor Walzer has just said. A brief comment is that you don't start thinking about those issues during that split of a second that you've given when you face enemy, okay? If you're an officer, you went to an American Army officer, you have been to West Point, you've been to briefings, you've been to all kinds of gatherings where you learned to exercise the profession of a combatant, of a commander of combatants. So I mean, usually we think in terms of one split of a second, but it's never one split of a second. It's one split of a second after thousands of seconds and hundreds of thousands of seconds of having thought about it, which makes it easier. Doesn't make it easy, but makes it easier. You don't start doing all the calculations within a few seconds. Now, as for the comparison between Lebanon and Gaza on the one hand and Afghanistan on the other hand, I think one should draw a distinction between two types of situations. And the distinction can be drawn on the dimension of whether you do or do not have effective control over the area. We do not govern Gaza. We do not govern Lebanon. Therefore, when the IDF fights in Lebanon, southern Lebanon or in Gaza, it means that we fight on a territory of the enemy. We don't have effective control on it. However, we do have effective control in Israel. We do have effective control in most of the Palestinian territories. We do have effective control in the Golan Heights and East Jerusalem and other places which, strictly speaking, are not within Israel. So when you have effective control, then some of those activities are done according to police ethics. You're not going, police officers are not going to cause collateral damage. Any collateral damage cannot be caused by police officers when they act against a criminal within Israel or within territories where Israel has effective control. Now, Americans in Afghanistan saw two different periods. During the first period of American war after September 11 against the Taliban in Afghanistan, it was war. And therefore, in war, what applied were the principles of war. Therefore, they could order an airstrike if it's okay with the objectives of the attack and with proportionality considerations and things like this. However, from a certain moment on, the combination of the Afghan government and American forces and NATO forces and other ones who are there do have effective control. Now American forces in Afghanistan are friends of the government. They're not fighting an enemy, terroristic activities. They're not fighting against terroristic activities of the Taliban. They're fighting against insurgents, which means that within a state whose government has sort of an effective control over the territory, they help the government to maintain control and maintain law and order. So they should be very careful not causing collateral damage, because causing collateral damage under those circumstances is like police officers causing collateral damage, which is wrong. Therefore, comparison of Afghanistan and on the one hand and Gaza and Lebanon on the other hand should be more specific concerning which period of American activities in Afghanistan is under consideration. If you take the first period, the comparison should hold. If you take the other period, it doesn't hold.
I would imagine that some of the men on the ground would perhaps ask you what happens if it's true that we can come back and fight another day, but so can the other guys, which complicates matters. Other questions? Please, sir.
Yes, I have a question for both gentlemen. The United States ended the war with Japan by dropping 2 atomic bombs on 2 basically civilian targets. Yet the state of Israel allows our enemies in Gaza to send thousands of projectiles on approximately 1 million Israelis. Would it not be right and proper to use the American approach to war, go into Gaza, clean up the mess that is there, and stop both the killing of Palestinians, who are part and parcel of collateral damage when we attack, as well as our own citizens, to whom both the Army and the government have a lawful obligation?
You would just, let's see, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were about 200,000 people killed, and a generation of genetic damage to children. And so you would just go in, kill 200,000 Palestinians, maybe wipe out 1.5 million while you're at it. That would solve the problem. But you know it wouldn't solve the problem because, of course, the whole world would then be at war with you. Look, in truth, it was a moral wrong to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I've argued that in my book, and I've argued it at military academies. An awful lot of professional soldiers in the United States believe that the recommendations of the leading generals in the Pacific were against using the atomic bomb. We were using a weapon whose dimensions we didn't really understand, whose long-term genetic consequences for generations of Japanese we did not understand, and we were using it under circumstances where had we been willing to drop the demand for unconditional surrender, which we eventually did anyway, we probably could have had a negotiated peace without killing all those people. So it's not a good argument in World War II, and it really sounds a lot worse now.
I'd like to add a comment to what Professor Walzer has just said. Israel is a democracy. If you look at the moral foundations of a democracy, you find the idea of respect for human dignity. And it's respect for human dignity, not respect for civil dignity, which means a democracy rests on the idea that human dignity, that human beings are something special. And respect for human dignity should be maintained all the time. So sometimes you have good reasons for killing a person. But even when you are going to kill a person, you are not exempted from considerations of protecting human dignity. If you can capture rather than kill, you ought to capture rather than kill. So protection of human dignity is at the essence of your identity as a democracy. Therefore, inflicting so many casualties on civilians on the part of the enemy is inconsistent with the idea of your being committed to respect for human dignity, because you can't defend yourself otherwise. We can defend ourselves by certain technologies. We can defend ourselves by every once in a while entering the strip and acting against the terrorists. We can try to pursue peace. It's hopeless, seems hopeless with the Hamas, but still we can try to pursue some arrangement. And so you cannot employ extreme means under ordinary circumstances, thinking that would solve the problem. It would solve perhaps a problem for a while, apparently, but it would render your identity into some other identity. You're not going to be a democracy anymore, and we would like Israel to be a democracy, come what may.
A consensus seems to have emerged, not only from this conference, but in general literature,
That was an accident.
They are there anyway. Okay, there are two systems that seem to work. One system is run by the Red Cross, International Committee of the Red Cross. Now, I have only praises for the Red Cross in general. I mean, their ideas, although they are the sort of band, the Shield of David for a long time, but forget about it. Okay, but their general purpose was superb. I mean, okay, to alleviate the calamities of war. Now, so they have tried to elaborate the details and to render all kinds of norms into binding norms of customary international law, doing things like this. This is a machinery that is bound to fail because it has the form of take the treaties that that states signed and just try to apply to them ordinary means of legal interpretation. Okay, applying legal interpretation to them is perfectly all right, but there is a limit to stretching those legal interpretations, and therefore there is a certain moment from which on you need other means, and those other means have actually been used by all military forces of democracies, the USA, UK, Israel, Canada, you name it. So each of them developed its own doctrines. And that doctrine was not, as a matter of fact, the product of the international lawyers, who should be part of the project, undoubtedly. But they were developed by others. If you look at the American doctrine, Army and Marine doctrine for counterinsurgency, there's a book, you can buy it. I mean, they decided to publish it. General Petraeus was in charge of it at the time. Now the head of the CIA was in charge. It was published by Chicago University Press. You can read it. There is an appendix on ethics. It's ethics. It's not law. It's something else. It was written by a philosopher. I know the colonel who wrote it. So people who are in command, people who think about it as political scientists, as philosophers, international lawyers, and whatever, those who have some extent of expertise or experience should be involved, and it's not coordinated. There is no coordination. If you look at a map, I mean, each of the military forces does it on its own. If you compare the doctrines, they're quite similar to each other. I was involved in writing a doctrine, an informal doctrine, together with Major General Yadlin, about targeted killing and other operations of fighting terrorism. Okay, it did not turn into an official doctrine of the IDF, but it was implemented many times. So every military force did it. And what is missing is a stage of comparing the notes and creating a document which would state the way democracies fight terrorism, the way democracies fight in a cyber war, and some other doctrines that democratic states would share with each other.
When the Secretary General of the UN used a just war theory to condemn Israel's attack in Lebanon in 2006, our response should not be, well, we have to change the doctrine of just war. We have to teach the doctrine to the Secretary General. You cannot invent moral language that won't be abused and misunderstood and misused. False friends call themselves true friends, and that doesn't mean we have to revise our conceptions of friendship. Bulgaria, under the communists, called itself a people's democracy. That did not require us to revise our theory of democracy. There's no way of revising the theory which will make it impossible for a country like Bulgaria to call itself a democracy. Just war theory is a pretty good theory. It needs to be applied. It needs to be understood. We need to defend it against people who misunderstand it, sometimes deliberately. But mostly, I don't think revision is what we need. That's in all our discussions, as Professor Kasher said. I'm the conservative. I am defending I'm defending the old military code and the basic doctrine of just war theory. And it needs new applications, something like cyber war we've never thought about before, and how just war theory can apply to it, I'm not sure. But mostly we need to do it right. And we need to defend the for example, I'll just take another minute. Are there new distinctions that we need to make among civilians? The basic just war distinction is combatant, non-combatant. War should be a combat between combatants from which non-combatants are shielded as much as possible. Now, that's a very simple distinction, and Asa was arguing for making it a lot more subtle. I'm very wary of making it subtle, because subtlety doesn't translate easily into the difficult decisions that soldiers have to make. I would defend the basic distinction precisely because of its simplicity. And that's another example, I suppose, of my conservatism. I think the ban on killing civilians and the doctrine of limiting incidental damage, collateral damage to civilians as much as possible, and you don't have to know who the civilians are. They're babies. They're always babies. So whether the adults are nice or not nice, whether they support the bad guys or are secret opponents of the bad guys or are just scared to death, doesn't matter. We treat the civilians as one class, and we protect them as best we can in very difficult circumstances. If you start allowing soldiers to make distinctions among civilians, you're going to make war a lot more brutal for everybody.
When I speak about revising present arrangements, I don't mean crossing out parts of it. I don't mean giving away the principle of proportionality or whatever. I mean, those principles and those international law arrangements should be kept as closely as possible when a certain type of activity is under consideration, namely a clash between military forces. When you have another type of activity, like fighting terrorists, like cyber war, and things like this, then you need to create new doctrines in the spirit of the same arrangements, in the spirit of just war doctrine, not instead of just war doctrine, but something which would be an addition. So when I'm speaking about revising it, what I mean is adding whole chapters.
At the risk of alienating those of you who've had their hands up for quite a long time, and on the other hand, the rest of everyone else who's waiting for lunch, and at the risk of spoiling our appetite, I want to point out that I think the next round of this discussion may not be able to be limited to the decision of a junior officer on a hill deciding about the fate of a few of his soldiers or a certain number of civilians on the other side, but of numbers that are almost impossible for us to quantify. And because we are, after humanity has reached the capacity of self-destruction with nuclear weapons, it looks that we are now at least in a nuclear discussion which will require the creation of its own doctrine, moral doctrine. Now, the superpowers dealt with that in the counter-force versus counter-city issues in the bipolar relationship. We today, as a Jewish state, may find ourselves having to contemplate what it means to use or not to use weapons that have unbelievable implications. And how do we live in that era? For this, we will not be able to address this issue today, but I think it hovers over us, and we're not going to be able to avoid it too much longer. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for your thoughtful words. We should know that Professor Kasher and Professor Walzer have been sparring partners in many different forums and on the pages of many different publications for quite a while, a long time, and at least in their relationship with each other have been a good example of how to conduct a just war. So we appreciate that. Thank you very much.